project like building a canoe is a huge undertaking. There are moments where I feel like I'm rolling along, and others where I'm so stuck that it makes me feel like I'll never get it in the water. This is what's so wonderful about being a lifelong noob. While I don't have the knowledge before I take on a new project I have zero skills in, I learn a lot along the way. That challenge is what makes it so much fun. The ebb and flow of setbacks and overcoming them leads to a great deal of confidence in the next phase of the build. In the last episode, I bent and laminated the stems. That boosted my confidence for setting up the mold stations. This is an important step because it will determine the shape of my canoe. Let's get started. Setting up the mold stations is one of those processes that is really dependent on the accuracy of each step. If I get one wrong, backtracking to correct my mistakes is the wisest option. The very first step is establishing the center line. I knew this was something I shouldn't get wrong. Any variation in the center line would offset the molds, resulting in an offset hull. I started by measuring the midpoint at both ends of the strongback. I then hammered a nail at those marks and stretched a string across the length of the strongback. After making sure the string is taut and had very little movement, I marked the points on the strongback along the length of the string. With a straight edge, just like when I was a kid, I connected all the dots to mark out the center line. Now it's time to lay out the station lines. These are drawn perpendicular to the center line. I have 15 molds, 13 station and 2 stem molds. The stem molds are attached to the end molds, and each station mold will be 12 inches apart. I'll start by finding the midpoint of the center line with a tape measure and drawing it perpendicular to the center line with a square. This will be where I install the center mold. To set up the rest of the station lines, I measured and marked at each 12-inch interval from the center mold line using a tape measure. Then drew each station line with a square. Now it's time to install the station blocks. These will be what holds each station mold in place. I'll start with the center station mold, which will be attached directly over the midpoint line. I'll clamp the center block in place and then place each block on the inside line towards the bow, and then the same towards the stern. To secure the blocks, I first drilled a pilot hole through the center and then secured it with a screw. Then on either side, I drilled pilot holes and fully secured the block. Moving along the length of the strongback, I secured all the blocks in the same fashion I did the center block. Now it's time for one of the most satisfying experiences during the early stages of the build, setting up the molds. Here's where I'll see the shape of the prospector for the first time. I'll start with the bow and stem assemblies. On my prospector, these are a combination of the stem mold and the first full station mold. The station and stem molds butt up against one another to form a T. I started building the assembly by positioning the first station mold on the center line. The CNC cut molds make this really easy. Each have a center line that runs the length of the mold. Making sure it was level, I fastened the mold to the station block. I checked for level again, and then realized that fastening the mold to the block put it out of level. The first mold has some flex because of the block. I hope that attaching the stem mold would resolve this issue. Once the bow and stern assemblies are in place, the inner stem should fit snugly over the stem mold and against the first mold station. After a drive fit, I realized that the inner stems are too long. Before attaching the stem mold, I clamped the inner stem against the mold, marked a cut line, and made quick cuts with the miter saw. After positioning the stem mold against the first station mold and on the center line of the strongback, I inserted a block in the top hole of the stem mold and clamped it loosely to the first station mold. I pushed a block against the lower rear of the stem mold and clamped it tightly against the strongback. This effectively held the stem mold tightly to the center line of the first station mold. After checking level and a few adjustments, I began fastening the first station mold to the stem mold. As the first few screws went in, the stem mold slipped out of center line. To fix this, I placed a block on either side of the stem mold and station molds. Then I secured the blocks next to the stem mold to the strongback so that it would stay in place along the center line. I did the same process for the other stem assembly. You may have noticed that I didn't designate which end is the bow or stern. Well, it truly doesn't matter until I install the trim. I already have it in my mind which one is the bow and which one is the stern. Leave me a comment below which one you think is which. After both assemblies were up, I attached an upper brace on either side for extra support. This brace will double as a handy beer shelf for some long days of building in the garage. Now it's time to install the rest of the station molds. The center line on the strongback is useful, especially with the center line already in place in the CNC cut molds. But for accuracy throughout, I'll create an upper center line by stretching a string between the stem molds. This will both confirm the correct position of the stem molds and act as a guideline for the rest of the molds. To determine the height of the centerline string at each stem mold, I used the height of the tallest station, the center mold, and added 3/4 inch. After measuring, I clamped a jig and string to one stem assembly and stretched the string to the other stem assembly. After many checks and double checks, I was confident I had the upper center line set. So I began installing the other station molds, starting with the end molds and working towards the center. At each station, I lined up the upper and lower center lines, clamped the mold to the station block, and then checked for level. If the mold wasn't centered, I tapped it slightly with a hammer. If it wasn't level, I shimmed it where it needed it. Once level, I fastened the mold to the station block. I secured all the molds with a 1-inch wide batten made from floor trim. I wasn't able to find one longer than 12 feet, but securing 12 and 3-foot sections together worked well. Setting up the mold stations was a big step and a rewarding process that finally gave me the opportunity to see the shape of what the prospector would be. Not just any prospector canoe, my prospector canoe. The next step in the process is preparing the molds and stems and begin building the hull. If you want to jump right into that process, click the link on your screen or in the description below.